砸锅卖铁也要干成这事. We will do whatever it takes, even if it means smashing our pots and selling the iron to get this done. This is what China's Hefei Party Committee Secretary Sun Jinlong once said about establishing an electronics manufacturing industry in China. 15 years later, they've done it. This is the groundbreaking ceremony for DRAM manufacturer Fujian Jinhua in 2016 as it opens a multi-million square foot fabrication facility. This is DRAM manufacturer CXMT, now shipping DDR5. This is a third, YMTC, now supplying significant NAND volume for solid-state drives around the world. The US government has restricted some Chinese memory suppliers for fear of the companies flooding the market with cheap chips, they say, weakening the value of their own multi-administration government-subsidized enterprises. The memory and DRAM industry have been controlled by just 3 players for decades, and you've likely heard about them a lot recently because of the quadrupling of DDR5 prices in just the last 4 months alone. The 3 players are SK Hynix and Samsung in South Korea, and Idaho's Micron in the United States. But China is changing that, and fast. CXMT and YMTC, both founded in 2016, are 2 companies determined to disrupt the industry by any means necessary, and both are in China. Newcomers are rare, success is rarer, but CXMT has already taken about 5% of the global market share in just the last several years. Memory is a famously corrupt industry. That's not just us saying it, but judges and even the Department of Justice. Before any of these new companies in China were founded, the memory industry already had an extensive history of corporate espionage, cartel-like collusion, and theft of coveted trade secrets worth billions of dollars. Now, elevated consumer prices and unprecedented enterprise demand are opening the door for newcomers. China is offering 2 potential saviors. Those are YMTC and CXMT.
去年的12月30号，我们在这里举行了这个开工奠基仪式。那么9个月，达到了封顶，比预计的时间提前了1个月。武汉存储基地作为中国大规模的生产存储的第一个基地，
顺利赶超不如使命。
Since its founding, CXMT has poached hundreds of engineers, acquired 10 million technical documents that seemed useless but clearly weren't, from collapsed memory manufacturer Kimanda. It purchased over 7,000 patents in a buyout. CXMT has also stolen trade secrets from Samsung that led to indictments of employees, circumnavigated US export restrictions, and received over $5.5 billion USD in a sea of seemingly limitless funding. In an industry where all the incumbents lie, cheat, steal, and collude to get ahead, CXMT can't be blamed for just trying to fit in. In some ways, for the big 3, what comes around goes around. CXMT is growing rapidly. In 2025, CXMT closed its technological gaps to just 3 years behind the incumbent competitors, and that's despite not starting until just 10 years ago. 2025 also saw it securing 5% of global DRAM market share and expanding production to 270,000 wafers per month, or a nearly 70% increase from the year prior, and an increase of over 10x in just 5 years. Chinese silicon has long been the butt of the joke, but the fact that they're closing the technology gap to a 3-year window within 10 years of being in business while ramping production 13.5x in 5 years, that's gotta be putting some fear into the incumbent 3 that an outsider might disrupt their ability to make backroom deals. But CXMT isn't the only one for the triumvirate to worry about. NAND is used for solid-state drives and non-volatile storage and is made by mostly the same companies that make DRAM. YMTC has captured 10% of the NAND market, technologically outpacing competitors like Kioxia and Solidigm, and even attracting Apple up until the US government placed it on the entity list. YMTC outspent competition in capital expenditures to grow the business, accounting for 20% of worldwide investments in the NAND industry. Kingston's data center SSD manager recently explained with this.
So if you suck all of the supply out of the market, it leaves the rest of the world really in a bad position to be able to continue to do business and run their business. I mean, pricing is one thing. And, price increases are one thing, but the not being able to have supply in order to sell the products that you make, I think, is the bigger problem, into the future here.
Meanwhile, we're seeing constant comments online from users practically begging Chinese memory makers to save them from the RAM situation, in a huge break from what we've typically seen, which historically has been more cynicism towards Chinese silicon manufacturers. CXMT has gotten the best marketing it could have ever received, and it was paid for by competitors muscling margins ever higher and forcing consumers out. So some commentary: in the 17 years I've been doing this, I've now seen people go from this sort of cynicism or stereotyping of things like the AliExpress special, which is a phrase we've used, and even concerns about things like backdoors, to now basically begging Chinese memory companies to save them. This is a very big change in sentiment that has happened in a short enough period of time that I've personally been able to witness it now. To translate into Chinese what people are saying in English to CXMT, I guess it would come down to "jiu mei na," but that's because RAM prices have remained untenable, to the extent that they are now killing some of the computer hardware companies that don't make RAM or CPUs or GPUs, because companies that make cases and coolers rely on people being able to purchase the RAM to build a computer to put it into the case. And we'll have some more information on that sad news soon, where some of the companies are potentially going out of business in short order because of this. PC Part Pickers trends reveal that DDR5 6000 2x16GB kits have increased from around $100 to nearly $500 in just a few months. We even came across this kit for $2,000 at a store near us, previously priced at $340. So it's no wonder that people in the Western market have suddenly discovered China's rising memory industry. And in this documentary, as part of our AI dystopia series of coverage, we're looking into the rise of Chinese memory. We brought you this video with our brand new limited edition Disappointment Tour PC Build t-shirt on store.gamersnexus.net, recapping all of the worst hardware events in 2025 and one banned tour date style shirt on the back. The front has an array of GPUs from the big video card vendors in various states of being redacted, with a censored GN logo at the bottom as a throwback to our most prized time of the year, when we got Bloomberged. This is shown on the back of the t-shirt with other dates. The shirts are available in a comfortable 100% cotton with black, or a highly breathable tri-blend design with vintage coloring on the logo print. The back of the shirt has the best of the worst, referencing AI, what we thought was Nvidia manipulating the press, Intel being in total freefall, the tariff situation, and more. Buying one of these directly supports another year of independent reporting and coverage from us, as we're majority funded these days by the audience, not by corporate backers, as we've successfully wound down the percentage of ads we sell to revenue we bring in from public support, like from our audience. Thank you for all of that. Head over to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly for 2026 by buying a Disappointment Tour t-shirt for 2025. In light of the overwhelming bleakness in the memory market, we're now turning our attention to Chinese memory manufacturers, especially because of the newfound interest from enthusiast users and from business users alike in alternative sources to memory supply. That would be both DRAM and NAND Flash, for solid states for the latter. Two of the major ones we're talking about today, and there are others, include Zhangxin Cunchu for Chongqing Memory Technologies in English, or CXMT, and primarily NAND manufacturer YMTC, or Changjiang Cunchu Keji Youxian Ziren Gongsi. YMTC is really a lot shorter, so I'm just going to go with that for the rest of this. But those are just a couple of the ones we're focusing on today. We'll start from the foundation. In May of 2015, China's State Council implemented Made in China 2025 as a nationwide, ambitious initiative centered on China improving its self-sufficiency in semiconductor manufacturing within just 10 years. The 2015 plan had a sobering admission of weaknesses from China. Machine translated, quote, China is still in the process of industrialization and lags significantly behind advanced countries. Its manufacturing sector is large but not strong, with weak independent innovation capabilities, high dependence on foreign countries for key core technologies and high-end equipment, and an imperfect enterprise-led manufacturing innovation system. Product quality is low, and there is a lack of world-renowned brands. Resource and energy utilization efficiency is low, and environmental pollution is a prominent issue. The industrial structure is irrational, with lagging development in high-end equipment manufacturing and productive service industries. The level of informatization is low, and its integration with industrialization is insufficient. The degree of industrial internationalization is low. Enterprises lack the ability to operate globally. To advance the construction of a manufacturing powerhouse, these problems must be addressed, end quote. The action plan laid out a table that stated a focus on improving infrastructure, such as increasing internet access, increasing the amount of inventions, and declared a plan to reduce CO2 emissions by 40% within 10 years by introducing more renewable energy. On the last point, China far exceeds U.S. power generation. Of course, population also factors in. There's a lot more people. But even still, its embassy has declared 60% of power coming from hydro, wind, solar, thermal, and nuclear. The West's response to China's ambitions was largely critical. The U.S. Department of Treasury during the Obama administration took a critical look at mergers involving Chinese companies, in particular, reserving the right to prohibit acquisition by Chinese companies connected to the Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. The United States Chamber of Commerce also wrote this, quote, semiconductors. The Chinese government is marshaling public and private funds to develop its semiconductor industry. The IC fund is ostensibly privately controlled. However, its links to government agencies and other state-owned companies raise concerns about its independence, end quote. But look, we're capable of looking at everybody with a critical eye here. China, the US government, memory manufacturers from all the different countries there are. And in this instance, this statement sure is rich, coming from a country that now owns 10% of Intel and has funneled tens of billions of dollars of grants and tax breaks into various semiconductor manufacturing projects. And I await your comments saying that I'm like a CCP agent or something because 我会说中文 and because I just said that stuff and we're doing this video. So. The U.S. International Trade Commission mostly expressed concern of China's self-supplying silicon. Quote, multinationals have questioned their long-term viability in China, particularly after technology transfers are complete and competition from Chinese firms in key sectors intensifies, end quote. In 2018, during the first Trump administration, the Council on Foreign Relations expressed concern that the Made in China 2025 plan would leverage government subsidies to favor local manufacturers. It also wrote, quote, Washington argues that the policy relies on discriminatory treatment of foreign investment, forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, and cyber espionage, practices that have encouraged President Donald J. Trump to levy tariffs on Chinese goods and block several Chinese-backed acquisitions of technology firms, end quote. As a reminder, that was the first administration, so a separate time for the tariffs. German authors of the MICS concluded a 76-page report with this paragraph, quote, Made in China 2025 will probably fail in its endeavor to catalyze a comprehensive, broad-scale technological upgrading across the Chinese economy. The strategy's effectiveness is limited by the mismatch between political priorities and industry needs, the fixation on quantitative targets, inefficient allocation of funding, and campaign-style overspending by local governments. Upgrading the production processes might result in job losses among the less skilled workforce. China's education system is not prepared for training skilled personnel capable of operating sophisticated, smart manufacturing tools. As a result, the overarching goal of Made in China 2025, the deep transformation of China's entire manufacturing base, will most probably not be reached within the ambitious timeframe set by Chinese leadership, end quote. Broadly speaking, the Made in China 2025 declaration that's made by the Chinese government has been met with skepticism regarding its ability to execute on the plan, and has also been met with accusations of unfair trade practices, in addition to calling into question China's ability to succeed at all in executing this plan. And a lot of this stems from, government subsidies that are flowing into the companies to get this project off the ground. Again, sort of rich statements at a time when more taxpayer money than ever is being funneled into tech companies who decreasingly sell to the people who are funding it, the taxpayers, the normal people, to the extent that we now appoint their leaders to government positions and fly them around on international policy-making flights with our president of the U.S. So anyway, the year after announcing its plan, in 2016, China ramped its efforts and established several new state-backed manufacturing efforts. Back in 2014, China announced the founding of 国家集成电路产业投资基金, or in English, the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, aka the Big Fund. The founding note stated, quote, "The fund focuses on investing in integrated circuit chip manufacturing, taking into account chip design, packaging testing, equipment and materials, and other industries," end quote. And so we arrive to the birth of the first of China's multiple DRAM competitors that it founded in 2016, and the first one is Fujian Jinhua. In 2016, Chinese news agencies reported that a collection of state-owned enterprises, municipal governments, and this IC fund led to the creation of DRAM manufacturer Fujian Jinhua. The 2016 groundbreaking ceremony was humble. It had a couple buses, a gravel road, a big tent, and land cleared to fit a 2.9 million square foot fab, or about 274,000 square meters. Local news announced that Fujian Jinhua had a starting employee base of 5,000 people and starting capital of 34 billion renminbi, or about $5 billion US. 3 months later, after Fujian Jinhua's 2016 founding, the Hefei municipal government worked with private enterprise GigaDevice, that's a name that's easy to say, to establish CXMT, or Johnson Memory Technology, another DRAM manufacturer. According to Horizon Advisory, CXMT was originally called 506 Project. The report cites a Baidu News entry that writes, machine translated, quote, "The long-rumored Hefei 506 project was unveiled as the Hefei Johnson 12-inch memory wafer fabrication base project, a collaboration between the Hefei municipal government and GigaDevice, the first listed memory chip company with a total investment of over 220 billion yuan. 220 billion RMB would be about $31.6 billion US. Horizon Advisory also cited another figure at 54 billion RMB, or $8 billion US. These numbers seem high for initial capital and appear to be in direct reference to the 12-inch wafer project, so we dug deeper. We found a recent 221-page financial audit detailing CXMT in Chinese, including its founding. The document details a 10 million RMB initial registered capital. 1 year later, now 2017, the capital increased to 50 million RMB, funded by factory and equipment manufacturer Caidu Keji. Caidu makes chip test and sort machines, SMT machines, PCB ovens, and more. Less than 2 months after the 2016 founding of CXMT for memory in July of 2016, Jinhua Unigroup founded memory maker YMTC in Wuhan. YMTC is now China's leading NAND manufacturer and has multiple fabrication sites around China. Nikkei Asia Review reported that YMTC was founded with $24 billion USD of backing, noting that its newest facility under construction at the time of the report, written in 2020, would put it past Hynix, Micron, and Intel for NAND Flash memory chip volume. At the time, Nikkei said YMTC had just begun work on a Chengdu location for another 300,000 wafers per month. China isn't messing around with its renewed attempt at breaking into the semiconductor industry, and it's already found some initial success, this time and quickly. And with those major players introduced, we'll go through each one of them in a little bit more depth. Fujian Jinhua received international attention first, but it wasn't under the company's ideal circumstances. In a post titled, quote, "People's Republic of China, state-owned company, Taiwan company, and 3 individuals charged with economic espionage," end quote, the U.S. Department of Justice under the first Trump administration stated that Fujian Jinhua outsourced its DRAM development to Taiwan's UMC, another semiconductor facility, who the DOJ says then stole knowledge from Micron. The DOJ wrote, quote, Micron controls about 20 to 25% of the dynamic random access memory, or DRAM, industry, a technology not possessed by the Chinese until very recently. As this and other recent cases have shown, Chinese economic espionage against the United States has been increasing, and it has been increasing rapidly. I'm here to say that enough is enough. With integrity and professionalism, the Department of Justice will aggressively prosecute such illegal activity, end quote. As we all know, the DOJ operates with the utmost integrity and professionalism these days. Now, it's tough to separate the political motivations from the actual concerns, because there are some actual concerns. There are valid complaints about things like intellectual property theft and gaming the system, but at the same time, this is tough to parse considering the mix of things like the US's direct involvement in companies like Micron, where it's doing really a lot of the same things that it's accusing other nations of doing, like China, and the US government's active suppression of Chinese access to technology via things like export controls. And this is made more complicated by Micron's constant donations and lobbying benefiting politicians. So it is very difficult to parse the political motivations to maintain power of corporations that are funding the politicians and the actual concerns that might be more legitimate for people, not just the mega corporations. In this instance, though, the DOJ does appear to have been right about some of its theft of trade secrets accusations, because there was a heist of silicon secrets to get ahead. In a lawsuit filed in the United States, Micron sued UMC, or United Microelectronics Corporation, from Taiwan under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, Civil RICO claims, and the California Uniform Trade Secrets Act. Micron's suit stated, quote, since at least the fall of 2015, UMC and the founders of Jinhua developed and set in motion a plan for UMC to recruit key personnel from Micron's Taiwanese affiliate. UMC and Jinhua conspired to induce former Micron employees to misappropriate electronic and paper files containing trade secrets, end quote. The filing claims that UMC leveraged Micron's trade secrets to, quote, produce advanced DRAM products as early as 2018, end quote, which it claims has allowed Fujian Jinhua to circumvent a sort of self-study period. Trying to defraud Micron is a bold move. We'll see if it works. They've got some experience, considering Micron itself has faced convictions for price fixing, like its two competitors that it has. And it takes one to know one, I guess. But the way that Micron uncovered this should have been a lesson in corporate espionage for beginners. So get your notebooks out, take some notes, because never do stupid things on machines or servers that have logging capabilities. One Micron engineer tipped the company off by searching Google for instructions on how to wipe a company laptop before departing a company on a company laptop. He ended up running CCleaner, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs in the process. Later, UMC publicly presented slides that referenced Micron's own internal naming schema publicly, and the suit says this, quote, in a shocking admission of their illegitimate intentions, the slides UMC and Jinhua presented that day openly referred to the venture's first two DRAM products as F32 and F32S, which are the exact internal code names of DRAM products developed and designed by Alpida, later acquired and owned by Micron, which had been in production at the Rex Chip Fab, now Micron's Fab 16, where co-conspirators Chen, Ho, and Wan all previously worked, end quote. After that, Micron alerted Taiwanese officials, who subsequently raided UMC offices in Taiwan, ultimately recovering over 900 files of Micron technical documents. The Seattle Times wrote, quote, some employees rushed to hide what they had taken from Micron. Wan and another former Micron employee gave laptops, USB drives, and documents to an assistant engineer who locked them in her personal locker. She then left the office with Wan's phone, the one that the police had tapped, which was quickly tracked down, end quote. The US DOJ indicted Fujian Jinhua and UMC in 2018, charging them both with economic espionage and adding Jinhua to the BIS entity list, effectively crippling the company through equipment blockades in the same way the US entity list killed DeepCool's momentum. Fujian Jinhua's addition to the entity list resulted in UMC suspending collaborative operations with Jinhua so as not to risk itself landing on the same entity list. But it's not a slap fight if only one party slaps, so Fujian Jinhua got the base out and it slapped back. Fujian Jinhua, which has provincial government investment from Fujian in China, filed its own lawsuit against Micron. This one, filed in China, Jinhua struck back with patent infringement claims in the province that invests in it, with a court in Fuzhou City temporarily blocking the sale of 26 Micron DRAM and NAND products, domestically in China, that is. Micron said that revenue would be impacted by about 1%. As for these cases, UMC and Fujian Jinhua ceased cooperation. UMC pled guilty in the US and paid $60 million in fines. But Fujian Jinhua was never convicted of anything relating to these. Actually, a 296-page Cambridge report says, quote, in February 2024, Jinhua was cleared of charges related to economic espionage and other criminal allegations in the United States, end quote, saying that the, quote, evidence presented by U.S. prosecutors did not sufficiently demonstrate that Jinhua had unlawfully acquired confidential information from Micron, end quote. Micron and Fujian Jinhua later withdrew all lawsuits against each other, effectively settling. But it wasn't all without consequence. Placement on the US entity list ground Fujian Jinhua to a halt. Its DRAM production stalled out due to a lack of access to equipment from international partners. With Fujian Jinhua effectively out of memory, investors in China and the Chinese government turned their efforts towards CXMT. And CXMT ramped its efforts in 2019 and went on a spending spree. 3 years after its founding, CXMT acquired patents and patent licenses developed by Qimonda, which operated from 2006 until technically 2011 as a German memory company. Qimonda filed for insolvency in 2009, and for reasons that, for those of us today, are painfully counter to our current problems. Forbes in 2009 wrote this, quote, the trouble at the heart of Qimonda is what it sells. The company specializes in DRAM memory chips, which are used in everything from computers to music players. But DRAM prices began to slump in 2007 once demand failed to keep up with oversupply, end quote. In the following years, Qimonda collapsed and had its patents, intellectual property, and assets moved around between multiple companies. In 2019, Qimonda would become relevant again. CXMT purchased over 10 million technical documents and over 7,000 patents originally from Qimonda. Despite the technical documents being 10 years outdated, this acquisition built the technological foundation and, cynically, a plausible deniability trail for CXMT's DRAM development, eventually leading to China's first domestically designed and produced 8-gigabit DDR4 chip in 2019. A post on EE Times cited CXMT as becoming, quote, China's only DRAM producer, end quote, done using what the West regarded at the time as, quote, outdated DRAM technology, end quote. CXMT's use of stack capacitor process is what got it into DRAM production so fast, according to their slide presentation. Some analysts scrutinized CXMT's progress. Quoted by E! Times, IC Insights VP said this, quote, we do not believe DRAM production in China is easy and is not moving along as quickly as is often reported. In addition to potentially violating numerous patents, other issues include the inability to quickly invest in and transition to new equipment for next-gen process technologies, unable to match the heavy memory R&D spent by Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. It is and will be extremely difficult for China to build DRAM devices that can be competitive in terms of density, performance, and cost. Delivering substantial quantities of DRAM devices is also a challenge, since getting the equipment to produce the devices is very difficult, perhaps akin to the Cold War days, end quote. Now, CXMT wasn't new to cynicism from the outside world, but like basically every other Chinese company, it doesn't necessarily need the outside world with a domestic market of over 1 billion potential users. China has been backed into a corner by US government export controls, and in some ways, it may be having the opposite of intended effect, where they're forced to innovate and create things. And that's because the export controls restrict access to not only the markets that Chinese companies can sell to, but also the markets that Chinese companies can bring things in from. And that would include things like lithographic tools used in fabrication facilities, such as DUV in some cases of restrictions, or EUV as the obvious example, extreme ultraviolet lithography, especially valuable for CPUs and GPUs, made primarily by ASML in the Netherlands. And export controls include those on tools and on completed products, such as, for example, some NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, where special licenses are required and rarely granted to sell those GPUs into China, and that's ignoring whether China would even accept them. And so this has left China in general and its companies with no choice but to develop their own technologies, and that's kind of what we're seeing. CXMT underwent several rounds of funding in the years that followed, raising upwards of $5.5 billion USD in investments from both government and private entities, at least for the easy numbers we could find, and those entities included Xiaomi, Alibaba, and Tencent. Throughout the past 5 years, CXMT's primary focus has been on improving yields from 20 to 30% on DDR4 to now over 90%, expanding capacity, bringing fabs online for DDR5 with 2024 monthly wafer production at 50,000, then doubling in 2025. It also focused on strengthening its IP portfolio with new patent filings, which align with Made in China 2025's innovation targets, and catching up to its competitors in development of the latest DRAM generations. We aggregated a collection of sources to estimate CXMT's monthly wafer production. This data was pulled from Business Korea, the Chosun Daily, ZDNet Korea, and Coughlin Associates. We used reports across several years. Since 2020, CXMT ramped production capacity from 20,000 wafers per month to an estimated 270,000 wafers per month currently. That's a 1,250% capacity increase in just 5 years. For perspective, OpenAI's recent reservation of 40% of the global DRAM supply from the big three memory makers was for 900,000 wafer starts per month. That means, per this chart, CXMT is already at 30% of the 40% of the global supply that OpenAI just reserved. Here's another chart for comparison. Jukan recently reported Samsung's wafer production entering 2026 at around 675,000 total wafers per month, with Business Korea noting 170,000 of those being allocated to HBM monthly. HBM is heavily utilized in AI solutions right now. Jukan reported SK Hynix's DRAM capacity at 570,000 total wafers per month, with Korea's Junan Daily reporting 170,000 of which will be allocated to HBM. Comparatively, Samsung produces 150% more, and SK Hynix produces 111% greater total wafers per month entering 2026 as compared to CXMT. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any recent figures from Micron's total wafers per month that we trusted, but its last reported HBM output has it producing 20% more HBM wafers per month than reported for CXMT at the time. Considering CXMT has only existed for 10 years, this is breakneck progress while remaining grounded in the reality of going against incumbents. Now, CXMT supply is currently largely going to the China domestic market, so it might not offset pricing in the West just yet. If you're willing to buy from AliExpress, maybe you see that effect more. But it's going to take some time for that memory to make its way over to the West. CXMT is on an interesting track, though, because if it is able to accurately identify a gap in the consumer market and a sentiment shift from consumers, especially in the West, especially in the US, who would at this point change to anything as long as they can actually buy it, then CXMT may have an opening here. And anecdotally, in our experience over the almost 2 decades, when companies identify a gap in the consumer market, especially at the lower end, and they fill that position, they typically are able to establish a foothold that they can then expand from successfully. You really only need one generation of customers to be happy with a new product, a new company to them, in order to just stick with it because, well, it worked last time, I'll just buy it again. And if they can identify that, then there may be an opening here for CXMT to enter consumer in a big way. CXMT achieved meaningful market share throughout the same time period. Per Counterpoint Research and Yole Development, the company grew from a minuscule 0.2% share in 2021 to 5% in third quarter 2025 in an industry that is notoriously difficult to survive if you're not one of the big three. In that time, Samsung has gone from 43%, Micron from 23%, and Hynix from 28% in 2021 to 33% for Samsung in 2025, 26% for Micron, and 34% for Hynix. Samsung has taken a hit here, though some of its share has been redistributed to Micron and Hynix, but also CXMT. The Financial Times suggests CXMT may have achieved this rapid market growth by flooding the market with underpriced chips. Like Micron has told the US government, South Korea's memory companies are likewise concerned about competition that brings the price down. The FT article cites C.W. Chun of Nomura's Asia Pacific Equity Research as saying, quote, "With the rise of CXMT, Korea chip makers are facing a new reality where the lower end of the market is flooded with Chinese products. It is not a matter of technological superiority, but of volume, meaning that Samsung in particular has been hit hard by oversupply and lower chip prices," end quote. Oh no, not cheap memory. Whatever will people do? In December 2024, Taiwan's Wealth magazine supported the claim, reporting through machine translation, which may change depending on what day that's captured and refreshed, quote, DDR3 and DDR4 memory modules manufactured by China's Zhongxin Memory have appeared on the Taiwanese online auction market, with some prices even half that of their competitors, end quote. Due to CXMT's seemingly limitless government funding, the company is able to disregard profits and prioritize pushes for market share. Now, you might call that unfair, and you might even be right, but the memory industry is a notoriously unfair industry that, again, has been through court multiple times, with the industry being on the losing side over things like price fixing. So it's really not an industry to establish any kind of moral high ground. Where Jinhua faltered due to suppressing lawsuits, CXMT has made substantial technological progress that has closed the gap in the technology deficiency. We put together this chart noting CXMT's technological steps. The years behind column indicates the gap between predecessors establishing a DRAM solution and CXMT doing the same. CXMT trailed competitors by 14 years for DDR3. Of course, a lot of that just because of the founding date. 8 years for HBM2, 5 years for DDR4 and LPDDR5, 4 years for DDR5, 3 years for LPDDR5X, and it's currently in active development for HBM3, HBM3E, and LPDDR6. CXMT is rapidly narrowing the gap between itself and competition. Now, unfortunately, we've had trouble establishing CXMT's actual production yield just because there are so many conflicting reports out there. In April 2025, Digitimes Asia reported, quote, while some industry insiders claim yields are nearing 80%, others suggest the true rate may be closer to 10 to 20%, end quote. Different process nodes, different technologies have different yields, of course. So CXMT, for example, for DDR4, there are some reports that indicate 90% or greater yield for DDR4, which is pretty good. But with the closed loop that CXMT exists within, it's hard to take anything at face value because there's incentive for them to misrepresent in both directions. They could misrepresent as low yield, where you might throw off some of your competition for how close you really are. They could misrepresent as high yield to look better, but actually they might be throwing away more wafers behind the scenes. We don't know. They're in a relatively closed loop with minimal oversight from the organizations that we're used to. Now, there may be more oversight that I'm not aware of in China. We've done our best to look, but it is a fairly closed loop. So we're basically forced to just take the word of the analysts who are out there and of whatever CXMT says in some of its statements. Without a clear idea, though, of CXMT's yields, it's nearly impossible to determine the company's ability or cost competitiveness or true rate of manufacturing process improvements, but we can look at the consumer product pricing a little bit later to get a better feel for how they land there as some kind of gauge of its market competitiveness for actual end users like in our audience. For now, though, and we'll get to that, let's turn to YMTC for another form of memory, this time non-volatile NAND Flash. NAND Flash manufacturer YMTC also made meaningful progress in expanding China's memory industry since its founding. For the first 3 years, YMTC's main priorities were expanding its workforce, mostly through the poaching of South Korean and Taiwanese engineers per SemiAnalysis, as well as developing its self-made X-stacking architecture. SemiAnalysis wrote, quote, due to poaching a lot of South Korean engineers, YMTC's progress has been nothing short of extraordinary, end quote. China's companies are pretty interesting. They really, as we've seen through this research, seem to be willing to do just about anything to get off the ground and be competitive. And it makes sense. Silicon is a notoriously impossible industry to break into unless you have tens of billions of dollars to start a fab, or you're going to use an existing fab. And if the existing fabs won't take you, because through government regulations they can't, you're forced to innovate. And if that means stealing trade secrets, poaching employees, getting government funding, it looks like everything is on the table to get these organizations established. And China's companies prove that while they may be limited by access to things like fabrication tools due to export controls imposed largely by the United States, even on European companies like ASML, in the case of CPUs and GPUs especially, being forced to cancel China exports, they're not held back, the Chinese companies, by human resources, by talent, or by the ability to get people who have experience. They are mostly slowed down by access to tools. And that's going to force them to go more domestic for tools as well. In September 2019, the company began mass producing China's first 64-layer 3D NAND chip, the company's first product breakthrough. Within a year, YMTC launched its consumer brand, Zhitai, and began selling its SSDs through online retailers shortly thereafter. Tech Insights, which has since been victim of a political ban in the opposite direction due to its analysis of a Huawei GPU, where China put Tech Insights on its own entity list, published a report on YMTC's solution. Tech Insights wrote, quote, Tech Insights sees X-Tacking 3.0 as one of the most disruptive technologies of 2022. First, the innovative architecture doesn't really have a peer in the emerging memory semiconductor industry. Second, the restrictions recently imposed on YMTC have thrust this technology into the geopolitical spotlight. End quote. Tech Insights didn't find X-Stacking 3.0 on a drive at the time of its report, but it still had thoughts on the silicon and performed die imaging and cross-sectional analysis. Tech Insights wrote, quote, major points of evolution from X-Tacking 1.0 to what is reportedly included in X-Tacking 3.0 can be summed up as follows. X-Tacking 1.0 uses wafer-to-wafer bonding for higher cell efficiency and reduced development time. 2.0 implements NISI instead of WSI for better device performance and I/O speed for CMOS wafers. 3.0 introduces Backside Source Connect, or BSSC, for memory cell wafers, which leads to simpler processes and lower cost, end quote. At the time that YMTC introduced Zhitai, NAND market leaders were producing 96-layer 3D NAND, making YMTC about a year and a half behind. Attempting to catch up with its competition, YMTC skipped 96-layer NAND altogether, instead transitioning directly to development of 128-layer NAND. Although it still trailed in production, YMTC's 128-layer NAND was the company's first technologically competitive product, achieving a die bit density of 8.47 gigabits per millimeter squared, which semi-analysis noted was greater than all of its competitors in a NAND technology comparison chart. This achievement was only possible through YMTC's own architecture, actually, a pretty important one from what we understand from NAND researchers, and that is its X-Tacking architecture, or stacking, but with an X at the front and no S. I mean, look, the Western companies, they know you're supposed to put the X at the end and get rid of the E. They'll get it. They'll get it eventually. They got rid of the S and they put the X at the front, but they'll eventually figure out it's the E you're supposed to get rid of, and then the X goes at the end. Anyway, X-Tacking is YMTC's architecture, and it's one of China's first competitive and disruptive semiconductor technologies that has actually been deployed in the modern era. YMTC uses wafer-on-wafer 3D bonding to combine two wafers into one product with independent processes, which this render on the AATU YouTube channel shows. We're not sure if they sourced it from elsewhere. Pretty clearly, YMTC fabricates a periphery wafer and an array gate wafer separately, then uses its X-Tacking process to stack the wafers. YMTC using two wafers while competitors use one inevitably leads to increased costs, for obvious reasons, but also likely for reduced yield reasons. It should also result in longer lead times for YMTC, which increases the time to market requirement for a wafer to complete into a product. Still, this was a major competitive step forward. By mid-2022, YMTC began shipping its 232-layer NAND, which semi-analysis said at the time was the, quote, densest NAND, end quote, available, establishing YMTC as a true competitor on the global market. Despite a less than 5% market share in 2022, per the Yole Group, against Samsung's 34%, SK Hynix's 12%, Micron's 13%, and Kioxia plus WD's 31%, YMTC's technological advancements seemed to be outpacing those from Samsung, WD, Kioxia, and Solidigm. As a result, YMTC had a massive breakthrough from a major Western brand that expressed interest in using YMTC's silicon for its non-volatile flash storage in phones. Market maker, Apple. Apple is big enough to, in any industry, basically play God when it chooses a new company to work with. And Apple did that when it expressed interest in YMTC technology. Unfortunately for YMTC, there are multiple kinds of gods if you look at certain mythologies, and in this case, it was not a good one. YMTC's momentum was short-lived and drew the attention of the US government as a result of this. Apple began considering YMTC's memory for use in Chinese iPhones, with Asia Times writing, quote, Apple was evaluating YMTC's 3D NAND flash memory for possible use in iPhones sold in China, end quote. Asia Times said that there was a 20% lower price for this solution. Hearing this back in 2022, U.S. Senators Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, and Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, who now serves as the Secretary of State for the Trump administration, collectively called for a public analysis of YMTC and risks it presented to U.S. national security. The Senate website says, quote, earlier this month, Apple publicly acknowledged that it is considering procuring NAND memory chips for future iPhones from Yangtze Memory Technologies Co., YMTC, a state-owned company with extensive links to the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, end quote. Again, whether they have a point or not, the reality of the situation is the hypocrisy where Micron also has connections to U.S. government backing. It also has connections to U.S. military through supplying it with memory solutions. NVIDIA has links to the U.S. military-industrial complex now through Palantir and through drone technology. And to us, cynically, it looks like suppression of competition to favor the corporations donating to U.S. politicians, even if there are valid complaints there as well, just because of the hypocrisy of it. In fact, Micron has donated to Warner, Trump, and Harris. Actually, in 2022, the year that these two senators called YMTC into question for national security, Micron made its largest lobbying contributions in the history of the company. That includes 2025 data as well. In 2022, Micron spent over $4 million on lobbying and hired about 50 lobbyists. Now, it is hard to trust Micron's motivations with its millions of dollars of donations it's made, for example, to the Trump inauguration, to the ballroom. It's millions of dollars of lobbying it spends on its political contributions to different candidates, but we'll hear them out. The Senate page wrote this, quote, we write to convey that any decision to partner with YMTC, no matter the intended market of the product offerings developed by such a partnership, would affirm and reward the PRC's distortive and unfair trade practices, which undermine U.S. companies globally by creating significant advantages to Chinese firms at the expense of foreign competitors. Last year, the Biden administration described YMTC as China's national champion memory chip producer, which supports the CCP's efforts to counter U.S. innovation and leadership in this space. The quote still continues here, policymakers have for several years now conveyed to the American public the importance of a competitive semiconductor industry to U.S. national and economic security. A partnership between Apple and YMTC would endanger this critical sector and risk nullifying efforts to support it, jeopardizing the health of chip makers in the US and allied countries, and advancing Beijing's goal of controlling the global semiconductor market, end quote. This letter was signed by Democrat Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Texas Republican John Cornyn. And the situation changed rapidly after this letter went out. Within months, the Department of Commerce restricted exports and servicing of equipment used in both sub-18nm DRAM nodes and in 128-layer or greater NAND Flash, restricting YMTC's access to equipment required to manufacture the technology it developed. Like Fujian Jinhua before it, YMTC was added to the US Entity List, along with companies like Shonan Cambricon, which is a Chinese GPU silicon company. This effectively halts all US businesses from working with YMTC immediately, lest they risk landing on the entity list themselves. Apple then withdrew its consideration of YMTC as a supplier. YMTC immediately laid off 10% of its workforce after US sanctions. Now, we previously paid a law firm specializing in sanctions, actually, international sanctions and the entity list, to explain to us a few things about the entity list, and they're based in Washington, D.C. Here's a snippet of what they told us. Quote, this is the most comprehensive sanctions list a company can be on. It is administered by the U.S. government and means no U.S. person or company can do any business with them going forward whatsoever, end quote. The restrictions from the United States effectively ended YMTC's 232-layer expansion. Throughout 2023, YMTC continued shipping its 64 and 128-layer NAND domestically, but was hindered by its lack of Lam Research's advanced etching equipment and support maintenance. Yole Group noted, quote, NAND progress could stall due to a lack of support from key equipment vendors, end quote, citing a wafer ramp-up cap, they said, of 115 to 120,000 wafers per month. The South China Morning Post, which is owned by Alibaba, added, quote, without servicing provided by the foreign companies, its production has experienced delays. YMTC's Wuhan plant earlier this year halted production because of a machine failure, forcing the company to scramble for spare parts from other fabs, end quote. In September 2024, YMTC began producing chips developed on its newest X-stacking architecture. Although X-stacking 4.0 initially only contained 160 active layers, a noticeable decrease from X-stacking 3.0's 232 layers, it's likely a greater achievement for the company considering it was accomplished not only without foreign support, but also with active opposition from the US. YMTC has been set back on this, but it remains competitive in the NAND market and NAND technology. Now, there could be a larger gap where they fall behind as a result of restrictions, but a lot of this really depends on if the US continues to topple its relationship with European countries, for example, by invading them. And if something goes wrong there, it is possible that some of the critical equipment manufacturers decide, you know what, we're just going to choose to break rank and sell our stuff to China and not continue to agree with these regulations. So there is a possibility that there's a breaking point here where at some point nations that feel like they're not getting the quid part of the pro quo choose to go a different direction. Now, with all this, while we were researching this story, the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the idea of security, where the constant boogeyman, especially if you've grown up in the West, is that there might be something like backdoors, kill switches, and spyware, for example, something that actually China now accuses US companies of having, like NVIDIA, which NVIDIA has denied in its blog posts. And we aren't experts in security, but this does seem like a really important part if you're going to start putting system memory in from a brand that's unproven. And the same goes for SSDs. So we asked a few people who are experts in security and asked about the breachability of memory, of RAM, specifically DRAM in general, and SSDs. The concern we had was, what are the possibilities of things like backdoors or exploits that could make these hardware solutions vulnerable? And that would, of course, be a concern for chips produced by American companies also, and that's been talked about as well. But the political apparatus has largely pointed the finger at China. China's the subject today. They're the newcomer here, so we asked from that perspective. We emailed Mr. Bra, the independent security researcher, who was one of the people cracking the code on ASUS's many vulnerabilities previously, and we asked him what he thought about attacks executed through physical DRAM sticks, like with system memory. He wrote, quote, "An attack like this would be quite unlikely due to how sophisticated it would need to be and how easily or quickly it would get discovered by security researchers. The way I see it, for a backdoor to be implemented into RAM, you would attach a separate low-power ARM RISC-V chip onto a completed DIMM module. That would be the stick. Such a module would act similarly to a DMA, direct memory access, device used for game cheats. It would scan for known secrets using a regular expression in memory and then exfiltrate them via the Windows network stack. The problem with such an attack is that this additional chip would be clearly visible on the DIMM module, and it would only take one curious security researcher to dump the software from the chip, like in this video he sent, and expose the backdoor to the world, resulting in basically no one ever buying RAM from said company again. Additionally, for a company such as CXMT, it seems they only sell DDR4, DDR5 modules, not the complete DIMM modules containing the prior. This would make it near impossible to add a backdoor into those DDR4 and DDR5 modules due to lacking the free space required to embed an ARM or RISC-V chip." End quote. And Mr. Broad does some phenomenal work. If you want to work with him on stuff, I believe he does consulting on his website. We emailed a technical analyst who wished to remain anonymous as well. The individual stated, quote, "Memory interacts via standard interfaces, so there are some limits on what bad actors can do conveniently, i.e. without fabricating special hardware. The memory controller would be standard or trusted, and the DDR interfaces are well defined. No extra pins to send weird sideband signals." End quote. The analyst then sent a link and said, quote, "This link illustrates that physical access to a system is absolutely a potential threat for various security mechanisms. Note that this work requires hooking up a logic analyzer to the interposer or malicious device. In theory, you could probably make a DIMM or DRAM that does bad things, but it would be quite expensive, dedicated tape out, etc., and I suspect you would be able to detect the circuitry for doing bad things via reverse engineering. DRAMs are pretty simple. It's a giant array of bit cells and then a minimal amount of control logic. If there was something sizable in the control logic of a Chinese DRAM, someone would figure it out fairly quickly. Assume that, for example, Micron, SK, Samsung will reverse engineer their competitors, and I suspect the NSA would on general principle. DIMMs are also fairly straightforward with just a few DRAMs and supporting chips, registers for RDIMMs, etc. If you could fabricate a DRAM, you could theoretically code something into it. So it's feasible, but seems insanely expensive relative to other approaches. I'd be more worried about something like an SSD controller, end quote. These are good points. Given the US government's aggressive restrictions on Chinese companies and the changes to regulations at the drop of a pin if they begin to get competitive in a certain way, we would imagine that the US government would find out pretty fast if there's a backdoor of some kind in DRAM or in Flash NAND. And if not them, then as one of the analysts noted to us, the competitors of YMTC and CXMT probably would notice it in reverse engineering, such as Micron, Hynix, Kioxia, and Samsung, for example. And something more digitally complicated with layers that can be more obfuscated through firmware, through software, where there's forced connections to call home or whatever, like drivers of different types, or just making CPUs in general. Something like that might be a greater risk, or something like our second source citing SSD controllers as a possibility. But as for DRAM and NAND, it does sound like those are less of a concern here. So with all of that, at this stage, we can get into the product side and go over which vendors use CXMT DRAM products and which ones use YMTC Flash products, and get into comparing some of their prices for consumer products versus the market averages for comparable ones. We've already bought some of these as well. We found CXMT modules in specific DDR4 kits from KingBank, Apacer, Kim2Go, and TWSC. We also spotted CXMT chips in certain DDR5 kits from Gloway, iGuo, AData, Juhor, KingBank, Lexar, Thermaltake, and Kingston. It was hard to find these, as companies almost never advertise using CXMT, at least not Western-facing companies. So to find them, we crawled through several motherboard QVLs, or qualified vendor lists, to identify CXMT use, which occasionally specifies the module manufacturer. YMTC's NAND is in even more companies' products, including the likes of Acer, HP, Huawei, Kingston, Lexar, and Team Group. We won't read through all of them, but we'll put a list on the screen showing the companies we found using YMTC NAND and certain SSDs. Despite several companies using CXMT, we only found one RAM kit that confirmed using CXMT modules and was widely available in stock and shipped directly from the company. We bought it. The most obtainable SSDs using YMTC's NAND are either Best Buy's Jitai listings or Amazon's Fanshan listings. We ordered a Jitai SSD, but it was canceled by Newegg and its third-party seller after we ordered, at which point the price increased by $100. So, thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
Now we're going to compare some of the most easily sourced CXMT and YMTC completed consumer products. These companies sell to other companies who then put their DRAM, for example, CXMT, onto the sticks and sell it into the market, just like Micron or Hynix will do. And YMTC also has its Jitai brand. But we're going to look at these versus PC Part Picker's price trend charts to take some easy averages. Because DRAM and NAND prices are changing daily, the numbers are accurate and collected all on the same day and relative to each other. We didn't update them as we continued working on this piece because that's not the focus of it. So this will give us a baseline for how competitively priced these products appear to be on the consumer market. KingBank's 16GB DDR4 3600 kit was available for $106 on Newegg at the time we made this chart, making it $34 less or nearly 25% cheaper than the $140 market average at the time of writing this. It's competitively priced, but with only one widely available kit that confirms using CXMT modules, we don't have enough to judge pricing on and remain skeptical about CXMT's production capabilities. One of the KingBank kits we ended up with also had Hynix memory, so it seems like supply is variable. It's not necessarily all CXMT. Granted, the company recently shifted DDR4 to EOL as it transitions to DDR5, so that possibly explains why kits using CXMT are harder to come by. We think the amount of QVL verified DDR5 kits using CXMT indicates its DDR5 modules are on par with competitors and gaining industry acceptance. This next chart compares Fanshan's S880 prices on Amazon against the market averages for SSDs of the same capacity. At 1 terabyte, and ignoring speeds, the $140 S880 SSD costs $20 less, or 12.5% or so, versus the $160 market average for 1 terabyte SSDs, again ignoring performance. The $210 2 terabyte S880 extends the gap slightly, priced 16% less than the $250 average 2 terabyte SSD price. The S880's most competitively priced SKU is its 4 terabyte offering, priced at $380 at the time we wrote this, or $100 less than, again at the time, the $480 market average for 4TB SSDs. There are cheaper SSDs, but these Fanxian drives using YMTC's NAND are competitively priced and a potential source of relief for customers as NAND prices rise in the upcoming months. China's most apparent disadvantage is restricted access to advanced manufacturing equipment, which it doesn't really make yet, although it's getting there. This is an ASML high-NA EUV machine. ASML, or Advanced Semiconductor Materials Lithography Company, is headquartered in the Netherlands and is the only existing supplier of several types of lithographic fabrication equipment required for manufacturing modern high-end components. Although extreme ultraviolet lithography has the eye-catching cost of hundreds of millions of dollars attached to it and is already known to be restricted to China, even DUV equipment, or deep ultraviolet, has seen restrictions imposed when dealing with Chinese companies. A lot of this is because, although European, ASML plays by the US government's rules when it comes to China, much like TSMC does. And even for silicon supply that doesn't need EUV, restrictions on other types of tools and on maintenance provision still make it difficult for Chinese memory companies to get access to what they need. Now, ASML's EUV machines are mostly interesting for the CPU and the GPU implementations, and that's another aspect of industry that's developed in China, but they're also the easiest example of something that's been restricted. ASML's EUV machines are the most advanced lithography equipment in the world, and they're required for effectively scaling down past sub-7 nanometer production. The more advanced the lithography progress is, the denser a chip can be, ultimately affecting manufacturing costs. A single ASML EUV machine can cost upwards of $400 million US, although some machines have been quoted lower. In 2020, CXMT's lithography was reported as 19 nanometers compared to Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron's sub-15 nanometer process. It wouldn't need EUV to make that stuff. This is just part of why, though, CXMT produced around 2.9% of DRAM wafers, but only accounted for about 1.4% of DRAM memory production that year, when looking at the node that it's using. Although the US doesn't have formal means to restrict EUV, it has successfully compelled the Netherlands to deny ASML's EUV export licenses for China since 2019. ASML is headquartered in the Netherlands. In October 2022, the US targeted China's memory sector, requiring licenses for export and servicing of equipment used in sub-18 nanometer DRAM chips and NAND with 128 layers or greater. In June 2023, the Netherlands established its own export controls, expanding its EUV restrictions to less advanced DUV equipment as well. China has begun work on its own extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, and that'll be useful increasingly as companies move towards solutions in silicon that require EUV. The easiest example is always CPUs and GPUs, but the biggest advantage in the meantime that companies like CXMT and YMTC have is government funding, and a lot of it. The ITIF explains, quote, Chinese subsidies allow Chinese semiconductor firms to compete in markets without having to earn market-based rates of return, and thus they can sell their products at much lower prices, which places firms that do have to earn market-based rates of return at a significant disadvantage while also disrupting the economics of innovation in the industry, as companies depend on the profits from one generation of semiconductor products to finance the R&D expenses that go into innovating the next generation, end quote. In other words, the Chinese memory manufacturers could flood the market with underpriced chips in a push for market share. This isn't a unique thing to China or the US or whatever. This is just how a new company gets market share and grows. Critics argue, from their perspective, that the seemingly limitless funding from the government allows them to be less concerned with profits. That sounds familiar. In an industry dominated by manufacturers that make quarterly statements about prioritizing profit, and now featuring straight-up abandonment of some consumer brands, you could see how this might not be a winning play in the eyes of consumers who feel increasingly squeezed by mega corporations who decreasingly care about them. Chinese manufacturers also benefit from their largely supportive domestic market, which is encouraged to source from them directly. Tom's Hardware cites a report that some Chinese data centers now face government requirement to purchase over 50% of the silicon supplied domestically. Now, that's brought us up through the last couple of years, but the companies have obviously continued developing, so there's a little more to go through still. Fujian Jinhua has made a slight resurgence since being acquitted of economic espionage in 2024, though progress is still limited compared to CXMT and YMTC. For CXMT, DigiTimes reported in May 2025 that the company began phasing out of DDR4, prioritizing resources towards DDR5 and HBM development and production instead. DigiTimes explains, quote, "Industry sources say the sudden shift is policy-driven, as Beijing pushes key chip makers to accelerate alignment with national goals, especially around AI and cloud infrastructure," end quote. More recently, CXMT began seeking a $4.2 billion US IPO listing on the Shanghai Stock Exchange's Star Market, with plans of using funds to advance its production capabilities and technology development. Yahoo Japan also recently reported that Samsung's executives leaked advanced DRAM process tech to CXMT. As for YMTC, since releasing X-Tacking 4.0, YMTC's re-entered the market in force, reportedly outselling Samsung domestically, expanding production capacity, advancing its X-Tacking 4.0 technology to hold more layers, and steadily increasing its global market share, up from 6% in second quarter 24 to 9% in second quarter 25. In September 2025, Reuters reported that YMTC was considering shifting some of its NAND production to DRAM in attempts to enter the HBM market, in line with AI demand. In December 2025, TrendForce claimed, quote, "Severe shortages are driving a surge in NAND Flash prices and panic buying across contract and spot markets." Meanwhile, YMTC is aggressively expanding capacity, advancing technology, and planning an IPO and DRAM entry. This rapid growth is expected to boost its market share significantly, reshaping the global landscape, end quote. China reportedly made significant progress in developing its own EUV machine recently, completing a working prototype built by former ASML engineers in early 2025. Reuters reported, quote, "China's machine is operational and successfully generating extreme ultraviolet light, but has not yet produced working chips," end quote. Reuters' unnamed sources predict the machine will begin producing working chips by 2030, suggesting China's goals of self-sufficiency may be attainable in the not-so-distant future. Well, this story is complex. It features a lot of different motives here. There's political motivation, there's just market motivation, trying to sell more stuff, there's government market motivation, trying to boost domestic companies by all of these countries against each other, and there may be valid concerns of things like military use cases for these technologies. They are advanced silicon. Advanced silicon is used in war today. That's just how it is. And so there's a lot to really work through here. It's far too complex to pick any one particular motive for why, for example, the US government makes the decisions it makes. But we can at least kind of go through what their claims are. So there are some trends. For example, the US protecting its own companies for fear of Chinese manufacturers becoming too price competitive. China doing similar, restricting imports now from NVIDIA, or requesting its data centers to use more than 50% domestically made products. Everybody is protecting their own business interests, and everybody is passing money around between the governments and the companies. The trend of talent poaching in combination with strong domestic talent means that China is not limited by education, knowledge, or ability, but instead by access to technology like EUV, or now some forms of DUV. Now, this aligns with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang and his previous statements that China now has 50% or more of some of the leading minds on, as much as we want to criticize the buzzword, AI. But the point he's making is that it is an equipment restriction, or in his specific case, it was an access to market restriction where they want to keep working with China, selling things to it, developing in China, hiring engineers from China. That was kind of his main point. But at this stage, limited to access to technology is the key for Chinese companies, where it will slow them, perhaps temporarily, but it seems to be having the opposite effect of what was intended, again, where instead Chinese companies have slowly broken into every aspect of this on their own. And while they're not there yet in a lot of cases, some of them are starting to get there in terms of competitive abilities versus incumbents. And that should start to worry some of the incumbents, not from a political perspective, but from there's a new competitor perspective, and they're not used to that in this industry. It's just a matter of time at this point too before Chinese companies have their own tools operational. With such a huge domestic market available, China's not short on buyers for its own technology, even if restricted for sales to other countries. CXMT and YMTC have both made noticeable strides in expanding production capabilities, gaining market share, closing technological gaps, hiring critical employees from other companies, and increasing adoption in vendor projects. At the end of the day, CXMT and YMTC increasing their supply of flash and DRAM from a consumer perspective should have a positive impact for consumers on prices. It's more competition. And apparently more competition is good, but only when it's from the existing companies or something, depending on who you ask. But at this point, this is new competition from companies that aren't part of the existing supply. So they're bringing new supply in. And as of now, not a lot of that is making it outside of China. A lot of it's staying domestic. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some political, some just competitive, technical. But as it does start to work its way outside of China, there is a good chance that this decreases prices for consumers or provides a counterweight effect if they can compete at least somewhat on performance with the incumbents. And it's looking a lot better there than it is for the existing Chinese CPU and GPU designers, chip designers, although they're making a lot of progress as well. So if these companies, CXMT and YMTC, accurately identify the market sentiment for a savior and the opening for consumer products, and if they aggressively target the consumer market, they may be able to establish a foothold. Like we said earlier, you really only need one generation of happy customers with the product to get them to come back next time. It's hard to say anything in support of the three incumbents who have been convicted of varying flavors of fraud and price fixing. And in the very least, regardless of how these Chinese companies have gotten to the point they're at now, maybe some new players will shake things up and reduce the ability for the existing companies to play these games with supply where it just keeps it as elevated as possible in the price. Both companies are steadily progressing towards meaningfully challenging the DRAM and NAND industry's market leaders in share, and we're especially interested in seeing how the companies will affect worldwide DRAM and NAND supply in 2026. That being said, with US trade restrictions on the EUV and lithography tools required for the most advanced manufacturing, like of CPUs and GPUs, we're ultimately uncertain how competitive these Chinese manufacturers will remain in the future, at least until they roll their own out. So that's it for our documentary on the rise of Chinese memory. If you found this interesting, it was a massive amount of work. It was difficult. A lot of it was in Chinese, digging through source materials on a different part of the internet that I don't use a whole lot. But we worked through it, read hundreds of pages of documents to get this research to you. And hopefully you found it interesting and it's given you a foundation for who these companies are as you start to likely see more of them. If you want to support this kind of work and our research time spent on it, you can do so on store.gamersnexus.net, where you can grab a t-shirt like this one. This is the Disappointment Tour shirt from last year. We have all the worst hardware events from 2025 on the back of the shirt. And you can also grab things like our dice kits with 7 sharp edge, high quality resin dice in either e-waste inductor versions or in Snowflake the Cat versions, or our retro IO coaster packs that we launched somewhat recently that give you 4 different coaster designs for each pack. Thank you for watching. Thanks for supporting. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw us a few bucks, and we'll see you all next time.